All right, so security, and that brings us to authentication and authorization, and something called RBAC, which is role based access control. And there's a lot of confusion around Kubernetes authentication and authorization, and people actually tend to get a little bit of scratching their heads when it comes to authentications, especially because authorization is pretty straightforward, but authentication in Kubernetes is something which is actually kind of a hit turner. Now, first thing is, what is authentication? So, what do you mean by authentication? Let me give you a very simple example. Let's say you are working in an organization and you go to your office premises daily. All of you must be having ID cards to enter the office premises. What you do is you go to office and you swipe your card, and that allows you to enter the office premises. But even after that, even after you enter your office premises, it might happen that you are not allowed to go into all the department buildings. You are allowed in the office premises, but still you are restricted to go in some places, or you are allowed to go only to those places or those buildings which department you work on. So the first case where you swiped your card and entered the office premises is authentication. So authentication means that it allows you into the system. Your office premise is your system, and you swiped your card and you entered the office premises. But there are so many departments and there are so many buildings inside of the office premises. So even though you are entered, or you are allowed to enter the office premises, you cannot go to all the buildings or all the departments. It means that you cannot access all the resources of your office even though you entered your office premise or you entered the system. So this is what authentication and authorization comes into picture. The first thing is authentication. So you swiped your card, and that actually authenticated you, saying that you work in the office and you can enter the office premises. But even after that, you cannot use all the resources in your office premise, and that is called authorization. So authentication is the mechanism to allow you enter a system, and authorization is after you enter the system, what resources of that particular system you can work with and you can access. Let's take a look into authentication in Kubernetes, how it is handled. So we have this cluster and we have this master node, and of course the API server which is sitting on master node along with other components. What we have been doing so far is that we have been SSHing into the master node. So after logging into the master node, we created these commands, or you rather executed these commands like kubectl create, delete, get, etc. And these commands were submitted to the API server, and API server used all the other components in conjunction to create the objects or the Kubernetes resources. So if you see here that everything in Kubernetes goes through API server, there's nothing in the system that can bypass API server. Be it kubelet, be it any other component, it has to talk to the API server. So that means API server is the place where the authentication is asked for. API server does not do the authentication. What I mean here is that once you hit API server, and if you're not authenticated, API server will not let you run the command. That means that OS user should also work, but actually OS user will not give you authentication. Authentication mechanism in Kubernetes is completely outside of the purview of the cluster, and it is external to Kubernetes. Kubernetes does not provide any authentication mechanism. The user authentication is always handled outside of the cluster. And there are various strategies of authentication available. One of the easiest one is static password or token and X509 certificates. Then we have single sign-on using any OpenID Connect authenticator like Google, Amazon, Facebook, etc. Then we have something called Webhook. So these are the authentication strategies supported by Kubernetes. It does not mean that these authentication mechanisms are provided by Kubernetes or by API server. API server does not handle authentication at all, but when you submit any command to API server will check whether that particular user who has submitted the command is or has been authenticated or not. If the user has not been authenticated, API server will not be able to run the command which was submitted by the user. So, what are the various authentication mechanisms or methods available? The first one is static password or token, which is not at all used, and you should avoid using this also. So, in static password or token, what happens is that we create a file which contains the user and its password or token. So, we'll have a static file wherein we'll write the username and its corresponding password in plain text. And this file would be there in the master node of the cluster. Now, whenever we want to authenticate against this static password or token file, we pass the user credential using authorization header of HTTP requests. So whenever we pass the request or any command like kubectl command or HTTP request corresponding to a kubectl create pod command, let's say, we pass the user ID and password as authorization header. And then it is checked against the static file which is there in the master node. Now, as I said, it is very risky to use static password or token, and it should always be avoided. If you're trying to run something, you're trying to test something, then it's fine. Otherwise, it is highly not recommended. The next one is X509 certificates, which can be used in production scenarios also. Now, the way it works is we have this API server and we have a user who is outside of the cluster. Now, the way X509 certificates work is that we create a private key for the user using any key generation tool like OpenSSL. Now, after that, we create a certificate signing request or CSR. Now, what we do, we send this CSR or certificate signing request to Kubernetes, to the API server. So basically, we are registering this user in the Kubernetes cluster. Kubernetes or the API server approves this user, and after approval, this user can send commands to the API server. While sending the commands, the user uses this private key, and this private key is sent along with the command. And once it is sent, API server can authenticate because the user is already approved from API server side. Now, by commands, I mean that kubectl get pods, create pods, delete services, create services, etc. All the Kubernetes API commands. The next one is Webhook. You can think of Webhook as event driven. What happens is that you have a user, and of course you have the API server. And in case of Webhook, the authentication is handled by third-party identity provider, let's say GitHub. The way it works is that the user creates the token for itself in GitHub and gets the token back. And now what happens whenever the user sends any command to API server, the user sends the token along with the command. Now it triggers an event and API server takes the token and goes and talks to the third party identity provider like GitHub and asks whether the token is valid or not. Now, when GitHub says yes, the token is correct, it is valid, it is for a valid user, then the valid flag is sent to API server and the command is executed. So this is how Webhook works. Cloud service provider sometimes uses Webhook, but the final one, which is called single sign-on using OIDC or OpenID Connect, and it is widely used authentication mechanism in Kubernetes. Now the way it works, again we have user and API server, and we have a OAuth enabled ID provider like Google, Microsoft AD, AWS IAM, etc. Now what happens in this case is that whenever user tries to send or submit any command to API server, it first authenticates to this OAuth enabled identity provider. Now once the authentication is done, these ID providers sends a bearer token, which is nothing but a JSON web token or JWT, and that JWT is sent with the command, and then API server takes the JWT and validates with these ID providers or these OpenID Connect capable ID providers. Once API server gets the validity flag back, then it allows to run the commands. So this is how on a high level authentication on Kubernetes works. Remember that As you have seen that authentication is completely handled outside of the cluster. So Kubernetes itself does not provide any authentication mechanism. There are strategies, and all these strategies are implemented outside of the cluster. You need to do some extra work for user authentication in Kubernetes.